Hi everyone, my name is Jamie and on behalf of Lung Foundation Australia, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. I pay my respects to all First Nations people and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. So we're very pleased today to have our three speakers and panellists joining us to provide an overview of the work of the CRE, Centre of Research Excellence in Pulmonary Fibrosis, who support us in holding these webinars and participate in the panel discussion to answer your questions around PF trials, drug developments and genetic research. So I'm now very pleased to introduce our speakers for today, Professor Tamara Corti, Professor Dan Chambers and Professor Joe Dickinson. Professor Corti is a consultant respiratory physician and Director of Interstitial Lung Disease at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney. She's a professor at the University of Sydney and is the chair of the steering committee for the Australasian Interstitial Lung Disease Registry, as well as a chief investigator on the Centre of Research Excellence in Pulmonary Fibrosis and a member of multiple international task forces. Professor Dan Chambers is the Executive Director of Research at Metro North Hospital and Health in Queensland and heads one of the world's largest clinical trial programs in lung fibrosis. His research focuses on the mechanisms and treatments for lung fibrosis, silicosis, transplant rejection and post-transplant complications. Professor Dickinson is a human genetics researcher based at the Menzies Institute for Medical Research and in the Centre for Law and Genetics at the University of Tasmania. Joe has been involved in the development of a nationwide genetics research study, which is seeking to understand the genetic basis of pulmonary fibrosis with the view of finding better ways of managing PF. So we're very grateful for you all for joining us today. Tam, when you're ready, I'll hand over to you to get started.
All right. Well, over the next half an hour, I hope to bring you a little bit up to speed as to where we are in Australia in pulmonary fibrosis research. So thank you, Jamie, and also Dan and Joe for joining us today for the panel discussion. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of an outline of pulmonary fibrosis and where we are before touching a little bit about the Centre of Research Excellence, which is what we have in Australia as a focus for the pulmonary fibrosis research, and talk a little bit about our next steps. So pulmonary fibrosis, as you may well know, is a group of around 200 lung disorders under the umbrella of the name pulmonary fibrosis, and all of these conditions have some degree of inflammation or fibrosis in the lung tissue. It's very much a bubble, with pulmonary fibrosis being over the sort of overarching, the umbrella term, and then we have lots of little different individual diseases underlying that. But there are some classic features, and we can see here on the CT scan and on the biopsy on the right that we get progressive destruction, or in this case, honeycombing of the lung tissue. We know that not in all pulmonary fibrosis, but in particularly in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, that it is a progressive disorder. And we know that it's very variable from patient to patient, with some patients declining very quickly and others taking a long time to progress, and others in the middle. And what we know now from our Australian data is that even if we pick up this disease very early, that it does progress at a very similar rate to those patients with more severe disease. And that's super important because it stresses the importance of early diagnosis and early intervention in this condition. We also know that the disease is increasing, and we don't know why that is, whether it's due to the fact we're doing more CT scans or we have better radiology, but our data and others have shown that this disease is becoming more and more important as time goes on. And there have been some new developments. We now understand more in terms of the causes of this condition. Now, this is a very complicated slide, but just to say that we understand more about the mechanisms behind pulmonary fibrosis. We also understand that although it is a whole bubble, as I mentioned before, that perhaps there are other ways of thinking about it. And one of the most recent themes is that we're considering progression, all the different types of the underlying types of pulmonary fibrosis. We consider them as a group if they progress, and that's called progressive pulmonary fibrosis. So we're learning a little bit more about how to think about these conditions. And of course, we also have drugs now. And back in 2014, we found that the antifibrotic medications were shown to be useful in slowing the rate of decline in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And then more recently, we have evidence to show that particularly nintedanib is useful for that whole bubble of patients who progress. And now, just last year, we have nintedanib on the PBS in Australia for treatment of progressive pulmonary fibrosis. So that's led to a flurry of clinical trials. There are just so many clinical trials that myself and Dan and others in Australia are involved in, and it's very exciting to see the new studies which are coming out. But also it's highlighted the fact that we have an unmet need. So despite the fact we have these medications, there is a big gap between what our patients need and what we can provide. And I think that's where, when it comes to what we're focusing on in Australia and for pulmonary fibrosis research. And the exciting thing to say is that we've come a long way in terms of the research in Australia. This is just a little timeline to show that back when, certainly when I came into this space, there wasn't much happening. And now we're very excited to say that we've now had a number of government grants funded at the Centre of Research Excellence in 2017, and then again this year funded. And we've got a lot of things happening. I'll tell you a little bit about them now. So that for a start, the Centre of Research Excellence is a coordinated national approach to pulmonary fibrosis research, and we aim to improve and extend the lives of pulmonary fibrosis through this comprehensive integrated program of basic and clinical research and education. It's a bench to bedside approach. So we do have multiple laboratories doing groundbreaking research, but we also focus on clinical trials right through to translation and educating health professionals on the most up-to-date research and guidelines. We also have a fantastic team, and this is just a photo of the chief investigators. And you can see they're all over Australia, and we have a very collaborative group. But what I like is this slide, just to show that, in fact, we are trying to be inclusive of all people in Australia doing pulmonary fibrosis research and trying to grow the team and attract the best people to the team so we can make a difference in this area. I've also got a number of partners, and I realise I've left my own institution off, so it's not a comprehensive list of partners, but we have a number of partners, both funding bodies, but also universities and health systems that are involved in research in Australia. And we also have a fantastic set of platforms. So the infrastructure for doing research in Australia, it's taken a long time to set this up and work well, but we have the ILD registry, which is the registry for all types of pulmonary fibrosis. And linked to that, we have a biobank for both tissue, blood, and lavage, that's washings of the lung. We also have the Clinical Trials Network, which I say here is chaired by Dan Chambers, recently changed chair over to Ian Glassball. So we have a Clinical Trials Network, we have a Translation Network, and of course we have our Research Development Networks, that's our CREATE program. And this really allows us to do a lot of the individual research projects. Just to touch a little bit on each of them before moving to the research itself, I'll tell you that the ILD registry is, many of you may have been invited to be part of this, but it's a fantastic platform with more than almost 3,000 patients now across 21 sites in Australia and New Zealand, where clinical information is kept, but along with CT scans and linked blood and lung lavage washings. And this is also linked to, it can be linked to government databases and also to a patient-facing app, smartphone app, to try and get a comprehensive understanding of what's happening in these relatively rare conditions. What's been quite exciting in the last 18 months is the development of the CT repository, the XNAT database, which allows artificial intelligence algorithms to be run on these CT scans, and also the smartphone application, which has just completed its pilot and going to be rolled out in a bigger fashion over the next 18 months. As I mentioned, we have the biobanks, which is very important when we're doing research such as what Professor Dickinson's doing in genetics and also what Professor Chambers is doing. We need blood samples and tissue samples to do that. The Clinical Trials Network has been very useful to be the meeting point between pharma industry, so pharmacological companies, but also the sites that are doing the clinical studies and the patients themselves and respiratory physicians. And our aim really is to try and attract clinical trials to Australia and increase the number of patients on clinical trials in Australia. And we have a website, you can have a look at it, but we endorse trials and try and encourage clinical trials for pulmonary fibrosis in Australia, both pharmaceutical company, but also investigator-led studies. Our translation education and support program is linked very highly with the Thoracic Society, but also the Lung Foundation Australia. And we've developed information both for health professionals, and we have a website supporting health professionals, but also, of course, things like today's webinar and other resources that we've developed in tandem with the Lung Foundation. And this is really to take the research and put it back into clinical practice. And finally, we're trying to improve the quality of research for the future in these conditions. So we are training our researchers and attracting the best researchers to this area. So we have a whole series of a whole program called Create, where we have weekends away, we have training weekends, we have a mentoring program, research grants for researchers to go and learn and from the best places in the world. So they're the platforms. Moving now to the actual research. When we started the Centre of Research Excellence, we had these research streams. So we had discovery science, of course, but clinical trials, health economics, translation, epidemiology, and clinical research. But halfway through the 5-year program, we had a strategy day where we decided to focus on these more strategic projects going forward, and they formed the basis of the future plan. So as you can see, some of them here, machine learning, the genetics environment into play, so the self-management via the app. Some of those things, including early diagnosis, which we're focusing on as we move forward. Now, of course, I can't go into all of these in detail today, but I'll just touch on some of the progress that's been made. So overall, it's been very successful. We've had a number of high-level publications, including some position statements. That's like a form of guideline for health professionals. We had a number of government grants, a number of PhD and postdoctoral fellows being part of our team, and of course, the new medication, nintedanib on PBS for progressive fibrosing interstitial lung disease. So touching on some of the more specific research projects, we have a stream where we look at novel diagnosis. And so this is some important information from the Australian IPF registry, where we actually showed that 23% of the patients referred to the registry didn't fit the international guidelines for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Now, that was somewhat surprising, but also what was even more interesting was that we showed that it didn't make any difference in terms of the way these patients were treated or their outcome. So that has in fact led back to the changes in the international guidelines, which has been it's really helping to change the field as we move forward. The second thing from this stream was looking at how to standardize diagnosis. So in fact, the gold standard for diagnosing pulmonary fibrosis is at a multidisciplinary meeting. And work that we had done and others have shown that there's quite a lot of variability between these meetings. And Dr. Alan Teo did this as part of his PhD. He looked at what were the essential features for a multidisciplinary meeting. And moving forward, we're trying to work at how to standardize these meetings and diagnosis for the future. And then, of course, we're looking at novel diagnostic techniques. And so this is both the work of Dr. Adele G, where she looked at nail fold capillaroscopy, a very interesting way of looking with a microscope at the back of your nail folds to see if there's any form of autoimmune disease underlying the pulmonary fibrosis. But also Dr. Laura Glenn, who's looking at digitalizing biopsy samples and cryobiopsy samples and looking at applying artificial intelligence for that. So one of my most favourite parts of the research in the last few years has been this study where we've looked at CT scans and taken CT scans and applied artificial intelligence algorithm together with work done with Dr. Simon Walsh over at Imperial College in London. And although it gives you lots of pretty pictures there, basically what that means is that by taking a CT at diagnosis, we can predict outcomes for an individual. And that's really what important information when we're making decisions about treatment and choosing treatment, but also choosing when to start treatment, when to refer for transplant, that sort of thing. So that's also work which is now going on to integrate that into the clinical practice, and that's work that's happening at the moment. So moving now to some more discovery science. This is work done by Professor Ewan Moodley and many of us, looking at biomarkers, so blood biomarkers, again, looking to see whether at one point of time a blood test can predict outcomes for an individual. And actually what he and everyone in that study showed was that there was a score, including a number of these algorithms there, including MMP7, ICAM, osteopontin, they're all blood biomarkers. And having a higher level of those and a higher score predicted patients with a worse outcome. And what I thought was particularly interesting in this study was that it provided additional information above and beyond what we can get just from doing simple things like lung function. Most of the biomarker studies worldwide have been useful, but not provided additional information above and beyond what we have, the tools that we have to hand. Professor Moodley's gone on to look at those biomarkers in response to therapy, and that's ongoing work at the moment. He's also looking at novel biomarkers, and I won't go into the detail there, but there are a number of novel biomarkers that we're looking again to refine diagnosis and also predict the outcome for an individual. And now I have Professor Chambers online, so I hate to, he'll have to correct me if there's anything I say that it's wrong. But one of the most exciting parts of this program is the profibrotic macrophage. And so Professor Chambers and his group have characterized these profibrotic macrophages in bronchoalveolar lavage fluid. That's a fluid from a bronchoscopy inside the lungs, and identified these cells as being an important part of progressing fibrosis. And then taken that a step further by cross-matching it with an in silico database of potential compounds for treatment, identified some matches, and then are progressing this in terms of potential novel treatments for the future. And I like this slide, again, courtesy of Professor Chambers, to point out this one particular match, which was from the roots of a rainforest tree in far north Queensland. So that's just an example, I think, of the next generation of potential therapeutic targets that can be taken and developed in the next few years. And Professor Chambers can answer all the questions about that in a minute. And now I'll turn a little bit to genetics, because I think one of the most, another really exciting area where we've made some progress, and really progress has been made worldwide in the last few years, is in genetics in pulmonary fibrosis. And so we and others were a part of this very big, probably the biggest study in the world, looking at the genetics of pulmonary fibrosis. And that's important because they found some genetic code which was predictive of having pulmonary fibrosis. But I think what's even more exciting is the work done in the genetic research in IPF study, the GRIP study, which is a national study which Professor Dickinson and myself and Professor Chambers are all involved in. And that's looking at Australian families that have a history of more than 2 people with pulmonary fibrosis. And you can see these are just some family trees. But what's been exciting from that study is that 5 novel variants have been identified, which are likely to be related to the cause of pulmonary fibrosis in those families. And that alone means not so much, but it's very exciting to think about what the next steps might be. And that is to really understand whether those variants are related to the pulmonary fibrosis in those families, but also to take it a step further and see if that we can look at using those variants to help design future genetic targeted therapies. And that's work which we are in the process of planning and doing. I'll touch a little bit on epidemiology. It's perhaps not so high tech, but it's been very important as we talk to government and we try and raise the profile of pulmonary fibrosis and attract government funding. So I won't go through the detail, but we, together with Professor Palmer and Professor Walters down in Tasmania and Melbourne, have highlighted what the actual incidence and prevalence, so how common this condition is in Australia, what the mortality and survival are, so how severe it is, what's the rate of death in Australia. And we've also looked at the relationship between air pollution. So these things are really important when talking to government and advocating for people living with this condition. As I said, we've also been looking at understanding the causes. So we've looked at occupational and environmental risk factors, and also looking at, physicians, so where people live and whether that's related to the condition or the progression of the condition as well. We've also looked at the economic burden as well. I'm not going to go into it, but we've done a lot of important research looking at quality of life and cost burden of the disease, again, which is super important when liaising with the government and the PBAC, looking at getting drugs approved. And then we also have a number of clinical trials that the Centre of Research Excellence oversees. I think there's at least 5, so I'll just touch on them briefly so you are aware of them. But there's the FOX trial, which looks at ambulatory oxygen, so portable oxygen for patients who wouldn't otherwise be on oxygen. That's currently recruiting under the leadership of Professor Holland at Monash. We also have the high-intensity interval training, so the HITS trial. That's a trial looking at whether high-intensity pulmonary rehab is better than just standard pulmonary rehab, and that's another multi-centre trial being run by Professor Holland. There's a telescope study headed up by Professor Chambers looking at a drug called danazol and repurposing that in patients who have a particular genetic profile and also have pulmonary fibrosis. That's a very exciting trial, the first in its kind globally, looking at genetically targeted treatment in this condition. And of course, the SHIELD study, which is a study looking at silicosis and washing the lungs out, also again headed up by Professor Chambers with a number of sites across Australia and New Zealand. There's the Rebuild self-management study, which is looking at our self-management app which I mentioned briefly before. And that's a study which has just been started, just been funded in the last few months. And another study also just been funded by, led by Professor Ewan Moodley, looking at whether treatable traits, so that's identifying particular subtypes of pulmonary fibrosis, might be a better approach. And we take that approach from the success that they've had in asthma. And so hopefully reapplying that approach in pulmonary fibrosis. So finally, we do have a translation arm of research. And so what we've done, and some of you may have been involved in this, is a research priority setting. So Professor Holland led this study, it was a couple of years ago, to try and identify what are the 10 priorities that patients and their carers have identified for our research. And I won't go through all of them, but we've really taken that to heart and modified our future plan based on those priorities that were outlined in that study. I'll touch on a little bit on self-management, just to say that we do understand that this is a very strong theme in our feedback from patients, is that self-management is very important. We do have an arm of self-management research, and this is something that we're working towards. So I'll just put that out there. And also to say that we are trying to feed all of this back to health professionals in the form of position statements. And I think we've got 3 published, another 2 in publication at the moment. And to say that we understand that despite all our best efforts, things don't get through perfectly, and we're trying to look at what are the barriers and the facilitators to best care. And so again, Gabriela Tiskelis is leading that work, and that's ongoing work, because we're really focused on standard care, both in the country and the city, across institutions, and that's something that we've really tried to focus on moving forward. So what next? This is a mind map from myself as to where we're going moving forward. We've really, as I said, taken to heart the priorities set by our patients and their carers. And I've grouped them in 3 pillars here. There's understanding causes and improving early diagnosis, preventing disease progression, and improving treatment, symptoms, and patient care. And so they're the 3 pillars as we move forward with our research streams. And of course, there's a whole lot of things that underlie that, including the gene-environment interactions, our health economics research, but also the infrastructure, the platforms that I mentioned before, which are critical to any of this research going ahead. So finally, our mission is to transform and extend the lives of patients with pulmonary fibrosis, and to accelerate research outcomes through collaboration. One example would be, I think it's quite a nice tangible example, is a drug pipeline where the genetic research is being done by Professor Dickinson, the macrophage work is being done by Professor Chambers, the phase 1 clinical trial might be done by Professor Glassbowl down in Melbourne. I might be part of the phase 2 trial. Professor Holland might be part of the translation. So really using that collaborative network across Australia to actually ensure that the research from the lab is taken right the way through into the patient. So I do acknowledge that we have a long way to go. There are still a lot of unmet needs, but that is in fact the driving force as we move forward, why many of us work so hard in this area. So I'll finish now. I realise that's about half an hour of talking, so you might want to go to the panel discussion. But just to say, I want to acknowledge my team working at RPA with me, the larger research team. I've mentioned many studies that I myself did not lead, so to acknowledge that it is a collaboration. And I'll finish there, and we can go to questions. Thank you very much, Jamie.
Thanks so much, Tam. It's really incredible to hear of the work that's being produced through the CRE and be able to highlight that for our audience as well. So thank you. We might unpack some of those areas a little bit more now going into the Q&A. I'm just going to share. Firstly, how many stages are involved in a clinical trial? Are there set timeframes that are adhered to, or is this dependent on certain things within the trial, like the numbers of people participating?
Thanks very much, Jamie, and thanks very much for the question, and thanks, Tam, for a fantastic overview of the work of the CRE. So I think this question is really about how clinical trial development is designed. There are 3 phases for clinical trials. So phase 1 generally means the first time this drug has been tested in humans, and that is only initiated if there's a lot of work done prior to that to confirm that this looks like it's really going to be useful. Those trials are usually a small number of people, say 20 or 30 participants, and really focused on whether it's feasible to give this drug and whether it's safe to give this drug to humans. A phase 2 study is a larger study, generally in say 100, 120 patients is quite common. And this is the time when the first attempt to find out whether this medication might be effective is undertaken. So one of the main outcomes there is whether there seems to be some positive impact of the drug on the disease under study. And for pulmonary fibrosis, the main thing that's looked at there is lung function over time and typically the forced vital capacity. If that study, the phase 2 study, is positive, then move to a phase 3 study, which is usually very large. So typically in pulmonary fibrosis, it's sort of 600 people. Again, these are randomized studies, so placebo generally versus active, and that's generally the large study. These days, often 2 replicate studies, very similar or identical in design, and that's the sort of final step before a drug would then be approved all over the world. So I hope that that answers the question. How long that process takes, certainly years, but it very much depends on the length of each trial, so how long the follow-up period is. For pulmonary fibrosis trials, especially phase 3, it's usually 12 months of follow-up. And of course, it takes a period of time for all of the 600 or so people to get into the study. Then everybody's followed up for a year. So it's often, a couple of years from commencement of a study before everybody's finished the study, or even longer. So that explains, a lot of my patients ask, well, how come I don't know whether I was on the active or the placebo yet for my study? And it's because all of the participants need to be finished the whole trial before the trial is then unblinded. So someone may have completed the randomized section but still be waiting over a year for everybody else to finish the study before they can find out which arm of the study they were in. So it very much depends on the number, the follow-up and how quickly people go into a trial as to how long it might take. But it would be not uncommon for this process to take at least 5 years.
Great, thank you. I think that sort of jumped into the next question, so I might just direct straight to that. But is there a way to get feedback on a clinical trial that you've participated in?
Yeah, absolutely. So the best contact is your clinical trial team, so your study coordinator who's helping you through the trial, or the principal investigator or chief investigator, generally a doctor who is overseeing your care during the trial. They'll be able to give you information about how many people are in the trial so far. What they won't be able to tell you is whether you're getting the active or the placebo, because almost all of these studies are double blind. So that means that neither the trial team nor the participant know which arm they're allocated to, so they don't know whether they're getting the active or the placebo. And we don't know that, as I said, until the entire study is finished.
So are there any promising new drugs to slow down progress or of IPF more than the current antifibrotics that are available?
Oh, I think the answer is yes. Look, what's exciting at the moment is that every week or couple of weeks, I would be approached by a different pharma company about a new trial. And I think at present we're running about 5 different studies, but there are more and more drugs coming out, and there wouldn't be enough time for me to go through them. I don't know, Dan, if you want to pick one to mention, but there are a number of new trials, and pretty much most of the studies will allow people to be on background standard of care. So that's pirfenidone or nintedanib, and so which is really a step in the right direction, because patients no longer have to choose between standard of care and a clinical trial. They can be on standard of care and additionally be on a clinical trial of one of these new agents. So it's an exciting time. I mean, Dan, did you want to mention?
No, I would echo that, Tam. You know, there are so many studies going on, which is fantastic. And like you, I remember the days a long time ago now, fortunately, where there was really no activity to try and find new treatments for people who are suffering these conditions. So that's really gratifying. One thing I'd say just very quickly is a very common comment that someone might make to me when they're considering clinical trial participation is they're put off by being allocated to either an active or a placebo and potentially being on the placebo. As you say, Tam, all of these studies are done in addition to what someone is already receiving. So you do not stop your pirfenidone or your nintedanib. It's done in addition to that. So the way I think to think of it is, if you don't participate in the clinical trial, you're definitely getting the placebo because you're not getting any extra treatment. And of course, there are major benefits from trial participation, regardless of whether the new medication works. And mainly, I think, interaction with really expert study coordinators who provide amazing support for people as they move through the trial. But there are some really big global phase 3 studies going on at the moment. Probably one of the biggest ones is sponsored by Boehringer, who make the drug nintedanib. Australia is, I think, should be very proud about what we've done in terms of contributing to these studies. We're often, one of the biggest contributors to these studies, but I think we could always do more to make sure that all of our potential participants in Australia who want to access a clinical trial actually have that access, and that's really what PACT is about, like Tam mentioned.
Great, thank you. We did have a question come through specifically on inhaler-based treatments. I'm not sure if there's anything you had to add for this question.
I'm happy to touch on that one, or Tam, it sounds like you've got something to say as well. So absolutely, it's very attractive if you're talking about a lung disease to consider an inhaled route for therapy, because you don't get the systemic exposure that you get if you swallow a medication or it's injected or whatever. There are some complexities to developing inhaled therapies, because you have to design it so that it actually gets down into the air sacs in the lung, and that requires a very specific formulation. But absolutely, there are medications being designed. This is certainly how we see medications that are targeted, that abnormal cell that sits inside air sacs would probably work is via the inhaled route, because that way we can direct it exactly to where the problem is.
And so we were involved in the pirfenidone inhaled nebulized pirfenidone study, and I think you were as well, Dan, which was a phase 2 study which looked at equivalence between inhaled or nebulized pirfenidone compared to oral or tablet pirfenidone. And I'm not sure if it's just about to be published or if it's already published, but essentially it showed equivalence with much fewer side effects. And so that nebulized pirfenidone is now in phase 3 studies in Australia and globally. So whoever asked that question, yes, you're right.
Professor Dickinson, thank you also for joining us today. This might be one that I can direct to you in terms of, is pulmonary fibrosis hereditary?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. It's not a simple question. I looked quite a few years ago. I think that if you asked that same question, the response would be, yes, there is about 20% of pulmonary fibrosis where there's a family history of disease and it's likely to be hereditary. And these groups of patients are largely those with multiple cases of disease of the same disease in a family, and indeed the study of those patients has in a number of cases identified these rare, highly penetrant or high risk, they call them, genetic changes in particular genes that are likely to cause their disease. And this is sort of an exciting avenue of research, because we're interested in all of the genes that contribute to pulmonary fibrosis, and it's sort of really the crux or the starting point to understand the genetics and the mechanisms of disease, and also the starting point often for the development of therapies, because we found that gene-targeted therapies are often have less side effects and offer a good prospect for the development of drugs. But there is a larger proportion of pulmonary fibrosis that has in the past been considered what they call sporadic. And this is because there isn't really a family history of disease that you can pinpoint for those individuals. And also because we really didn't understand a lot of the different types of genetic variation that can cause pulmonary fibrosis. And I don't want to sort of get too far into it because it is fairly complex, but there are genetic changes which we all share through normal human genetic variation. And some of that normal variation between us as individuals, so because there are, we all look different and we have different, ways in which our body works, and those common genetic changes, they can also influence our risk of getting a particular disease. And some of the audience today might know of the gene MUC5B. And this gene has what we call a common genetic change. So about 10% of the population, 10 to 15% of the population carry a genetic change that can increase their risk of developing pulmonary fibrosis. And so we know that this contributes to the development of pulmonary fibrosis. And there are, but it isn't necessarily causative in all cases. For example, not all people that have that genetic change develop the disease. But there are also lots of other common genetic changes. And there is the school of thought now that pulmonary fibrosis is hereditary, in that everyone inherits different genetic changes, whether they increase your risk a lot, like the very rare high risk ones, or they increase your risk a little bit. And there's this long sort of a big spectrum of genetic changes that contribute to disease. So I hope that hasn't been too confusing. And I don't know, maybe Tam or Dan might want to respond to that, but that's sort of the current thinking for pulmonary fibrosis.
Jo, would it be fair to summarise by saying that you inherit the risk for pulmonary fibrosis, or the tendency to pulmonary fibrosis? That's what I tell my patients, is that some families, you inherit the tendency to develop pulmonary fibrosis, so the risk. And some families have more than that than others. Would that be a nice way of summarising?
Yes, yeah, that's a nice way of saying. So some families might inherit something that gives them a much, much greater risk, and other families might inherit something that just gives them a slightly raised risk.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Is there a way that people can contribute to genetic research in that sense?
Yes, indeed. So Tam and Dan and I are involved in the genetic research for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis study, which is a nationwide study. And at the moment, we're interested in recruiting individuals who have a strong family history of disease. And this is because we're interested in finding those high-risk genes, so those genetic changes that increased your risk a lot, because we're interested in finding new genetic targets. So to participate, we have, you can contact us, and I can give my information to Jamie to pass on to anyone who's interested. And generally, to participate, it's we need people that are willing to give a genetic sample, people who are interested in talking to their family members about participating, because it's much easier for us to do our work if we have family members participating, and then talk to their treating doctor about their participation, because we do like to recruit people who are happy to share their medical information and also undertake screening and clinical assessment, because we do need the clinical data, so their medical records as well.
Great, thank you. Did anyone have anything to add? So this one I'm sure can go off into a few different areas, but is there any research into the diagnosis of pulmonary fibrosis and potentially a delay to diagnosis and how that can be reduced?
So much research. I can start by saying one of the really sort of large focuses for our Centre of Research Excellence moving forward has been in that early diagnosis phase. So even before patients are symptomatic, and that's we've got a particular word for that called interstitial lung abnormality, but basically that just means when you can see something on a CT scan, but the patient doesn't realise that yet. And so, yes, that's a particular focus. We are looking at different ways of better identifying that. So one of the studies we're looking at is working with GP databases to try and identify and pick up these things earlier and try and do that. So that's something which we're currently just in the process of starting. We're also looking at those people with that very, very early changes and seeing what predicts patients who go on to develop the disease. So that's also something which is in progress, but where we're looking at biomarkers, in the blood, genetics, are there certain features on the CT scan, etc. But I think the person who asked this question is right. There's a whole lot more that can be done with regard to diagnosis and refining that diagnosis. And that's where the work that I sort of touched on earlier with regard to using artificial intelligence and digital biopsies, that sort of thing. There's so much work that we're doing. I could talk for an hour just on this topic, but there's a lot of work going into that. And I think, Dan, you're doing some exciting research in this regard, so maybe you could touch on what you're doing.
Yeah, so thanks, Tam. Yeah, look, I agree. It's a major focus of the CRE, and a lot of it actually is not. We are certainly doing some work that's very sciencey, but a lot of it doesn't come down to that. It's increased awareness of this as a cause of breathlessness. So I think we absolutely need to continue that education for health professionals as much as people in Australia, and we thank the Lung Foundation for taking a lead on that. Certainly plenty can be done in terms of expediting diagnosis. So you've already touched on some of the, imaging technologies. There are some really smart stethoscopes that are being developed because it's actually fairly easy to make a diagnosis of this condition. I'm sure, like me, Tam's listened to many chests, and then like I did this morning, and made a diagnosis of IPF like that in someone who'd been unwell with breathlessness for a year. It's not actually that hard. It's just that it's not done very well. So I think that's probably our main focus. In terms of making a specific diagnosis for this person about what form of pulmonary fibrosis they're having, that's also a major focus, because like almost all medical care, we're really moving towards being very precise about the kind of treatment that we advise someone to have. So that's a very active area as well. So we know that pulmonary fibrosis comes in many forms, and although some of our listeners today may have been given a specific diagnosis, we know that may not be the end of the story, and it really comes down to understanding the genetics, as Joe's already highlighted, and what the pathways are in that individual person to be able to design their therapy best for them. So that's absolutely where we're heading.
Great, thank you. In terms of, Joe, you touched on it before, in terms of genetic research and being involved, are there any other ways that people can be notified of available upcoming trials in their area?
Sure. So, I mean, if a clinical trial, so intervention drug trials, the best way of finding out what's available in Australia would be to look on the PACT website, and we can perhaps maybe distribute that. I'm not sure if that's possible, but it's on the Lung Foundation website, and there's PACT, PACT, pulmonary fibrosis Australasian clinical trials, and usually we will endorse the clinical trials that are recruiting in Australia and have the centres that are participating. And so you can look at that and see if there's anything near there. And there's also an opportunity to email the PACT coordinator and get more information about the study in that way. But so that's probably the simplest way, without knowing exactly what the question was meant to. The other trials, so genetics or other non-intervention clinical trials, we have a lot of that information on our CRE website, the Centre of Research Excellence website, and also I think just talking to your doctor and at your centre, because they will more than likely have been to conferences and be aware of what's happening. And if they're not, I'm sure they are more than capable of finding out.
Now, Jo, I'll come back to you on this one if this is one that can be directed to you, but what is involved in genetic testing for IPF?
Okay, so I'll talk to start with from a research point of view. So for our genetic study, in order for us to look for the genetic changes that might be causative in disease, we can use a blood sample or indeed a saliva sample from an individual. And what we do then is we process that sample to get the genetic material or DNA. And then we do very detailed profiling of that genetic material. And when I mean detailed, I mean extremely detailed. So 3 billion pieces of information per person. And what we do is compare the profiles of the people that have the disease with the profiles of people who don't have the disease. And in families, that's much easier because they share a lot of their genetic profile is similar. And if we can have a person with the disease and without the disease in the same family, we're more likely to be able to narrow down exactly what's causing the disease in that family. And indeed, with the work that Tam was talking about earlier, that's been our approach, and that's worked very well so far. With regard to clinical genetic testing, this requires you to talk to your treating doctor about clinical genetic testing and that of your family members. And I will probably handball that question to Tam and Dan, because each clinician in different areas have different linkages with clinical genetic testing and the way in which the referral process works.
I can certainly tell you what the practice is in Queensland. So it is a bit patchy, as Jo said, as the availability of genetic testing, even though we understand that this is a really important component of the disease in many people, and obviously it's a major source of concern for many people as well. We do have access in Queensland to genetic testing for IPF, and in fact, there are companies that offer genetic testing for a fee. The main issue now, and it's usually about $600, the main issue is trying to have our health services contribute to that cost for our patients, because as many of you are probably aware, it takes a long time for health policy to catch up with where our understanding of the causes of a disease is. I'm sure that will happen over time. So people can order a genetic test there are several providers and undertake a genetic test, which is usually just a mouth swab. The other thing that we commonly test for is peripheral blood telomere length, which we know is an important contributor in quite a number of people. That test is quite a complicated test. It's only conducted at Westmead Hospital in Sydney in Australia, and it's quite complicated to arrange, but nevertheless possible in some instances. So those are the two aspects of testing for individual patients. I think it's a relatively simple, straightforward question. If someone knows that they already have this condition and wants to understand more about what the cause is, it's a much bigger question if someone, so a family member, typically a child of the affected person, is thinking about having a test for a disease that they don't know they have. If someone approaches me about that, I always refer them to a qualified genetic counsellor to have a further discussion about the pros and cons of actually having a genetic test. You really want to know, what can we do about it if you do find that you've got the same gene? Does it even mean anything? Does it mean you're going to become unwell? All of those sort of questions, which are really, really important. So that's really, my approach here, and probably reflects Tam's, I would imagine, in New South Wales.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Like Joe said, you get billions of bits of information back, and I'm not the expert on that. And so I usually will, we have a combined pulmonary fibrosis genetics clinic, and I usually lean heavily on my genetic colleagues and their counsellors to help advise us on the wisdom of doing the test, and also in the interpretation of the result.
Generally, I find, after I discuss things, most family members of someone who has pulmonary fibrosis will not elect to go and see a genetic counsellor. And what I advise them to do is simply, as was highlighted before, a lot of this is around conferring a slightly or maybe even substantially increased risk of getting this condition, which is not inevitable, but there are definitely environmental factors at play. So, the important thing, I think, is if it is clear that in your family there's probably an increased risk of getting one of these conditions, it's just so important to not smoke and to not expose your lungs to anything else, vaping, etc., which may well be harmful, and to industrial dust exposure. So, be very careful about undertaking a job that involves significant dust exposure. I think those are the sensible measures that can be taken.
And more important than the genetic testing.
Yeah.
Thank you. And that probably gives a nice summary of into this question, or it's not necessarily on age that you would be testing, but a lot of other considerations potentially to be taking into factor.
Yeah.
I'm happy to field that one. So as I said, it's actually pretty rare for a family member of, typically a child of an affected family member who's my patient, to undergo genetic testing. I think the advice I gave before is sensible, and just avoid protect your lungs, look after them, look after your lung health. In terms of genetic testing, as I said, that would always be in conjunction with a genetic counsellor. Of course, some people are very concerned. I think it's perfectly reasonable to have some basic clinical testing done. So see someone who is a lung specialist who's familiar with this group of conditions, a physical examination, some breathing tests, maybe a plain chest X-ray, just to provide peace of mind, or identify if there does seem to be an early problem, is sensible. And that, I think it's very rare for someone to be affected under the age of 40, say. So, in terms of the time frame, very difficult to give specific advice, but that's, it's very rare for someone to have significant problem under the age of 40.
And the only other thing that I also would add to Tam and Dan's comments is that, remember, we only understand the minor portion of the genes that, or the genetic changes that contribute to pulmonary fibrosis. So while, so if you do undergo genetic testing, it may well be that, for example, that, as Tam said, that we find things, but we don't know how to interpret them, or indeed we don't find anything at all. So so genetic testing at this stage is by no means definitive. There's a lot of unknowns.
Yeah, it's not like testing for, something like a
bovine or
like in breast cancer, the genes where it's either present or absent. It's much more complex in pulmonary fibrosis. I think it's really important that the audience understand that it's not as easy as testing. I don't have the gene, I'm all right, I'm off the hook. If you have there might be a gene that we don't know about yet. And so it's more important. I mean, genetic testing is super important for us to understand more about the the cause of this condition, so we can help develop drugs and that sort of thing. But for the individual, it's not so important, because the most important thing, if you have the gene or you don't have the gene, is that you try and protect your lungs. And so I agree completely with what Dan said earlier, that's, that should be the focus. But certainly genetic testing is available if people need or want it.
Thank you. Now we are running over the hour for the webinar. I was just thinking, one of these 4 questions that comes up a lot is in terms of life expectancy, and if any sort of recent research, if there's been any known changes to do with that. Would anyone be comfortable and happy to answer that one, just to wrap up potentially for our last question?
So the standard thing that you read about life expectancy is for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which is one of those things in the whole bubble that I was talking about before, is 3 to 5 years from diagnosis. Now, we don't know for sure, exactly, because the clinical trials only go for 1 year. The randomized placebo-controlled trials don't go on and on. But there is data that's been extrapolated both from the clinical trial data and real world data following the clinical trials with the antifibrotic medications. And that extrapolated data looks like we're looking more 9 to 11 years from diagnosis, rather than the 3 to 5 years that it was traditionally quoted. But I would say that it's extrapolated data, modeled data. But certainly, I think that there's definitely an improvement in life expectancy with the advent of antifibrotic medications.
Thank you. Are there any questions there that anyone would feels would be important just to touch on?
Estimate the rate of progression with antifibrotics, 100 mils of progression a year. That's from the trials, and median age usually about 66. There you go. There's 2 very quick questions.
Thank you. In terms of the app, Tam, we've just had a question come through about if it's still recruiting and where they can get more information from.
Excellent. So yes, we finished the pilot. That's 50 patients, and we're just about to we're trying to get ethics approved for the bigger study, which is 400 patients, and it will be recruiting and hasn't started. So there's lots of opportunity of being involved. Once it's recruiting, it will be on the PAT website, but I haven't written the protocol yet. So just it'll be soon, at the end of this year, probably.
Okay, amazing. Thank you. All right, so we might wrap up there for today for the Q&A. Thank you so much to Dan, Tam and Joe for joining us. Before I close the webinar, I did just want to highlight the pulmonary fibrosis resources and services that we have for people living with PF and IPF. So the resources, we have a wide range of resources that are available on the Lung Foundation website, and they've all been developed in collaboration with the Centre of Research Excellence in Pulmonary Fibrosis. And these can be accessed on the website or through the QR codes that you can see on the screen there. And we do have some wonderful peer support options available also that are designed to connect people specifically living with PF and IPF right across Australia. And this includes our telephone-based Peer Connect service and our IPUF online support group as well. So again, the QR code there on the peer support flyer will take you to the expression of interest page on our website. So thank you again to our speakers and to everyone who's joined us today. We really hope that you've been able to take many valuable things away from today's webinar. So with that, I'll close the session for today and say goodbye. Thank you.